Hey everyone, welcome back to the Environmental Podcast, at home edition. We're sorry about the sound quality this time if it's a little bit different. That's because Alicia, you can blame her.
Yeah, I came over to Aaron's house to record the podcast. I'm going to stay here for a few weeks so we can bank a bunch of episodes. And I forgot the microphones. So we're going to get those shipped to us. But for this week, we're recording on my laptop. I hope you will bear with us and listen to our really exciting topic today.
But you know what? I think it's kind of thematic because our topic is kind of grimy and bubbly and just doesn't sound quite right.
You're right.
Well, it does sound pretty right, actually.
Ooh, really far right, you
because
could say.
Today's topic is all about the far right.
The rise of the far right in the modern times.
Exactly. So this is the second episode in our Modern Times series, the first one being Conspiracy Theories, which came out last week. And so we thought this would be a really fitting continuation from that because a lot of conspiracies tend to take place on the far right. And if you listen to last week's episode, you will hear our thoughts about why that is. So today, how are we going to be approaching this big seismic topic, Alicia?
Well, we're going to be looking at some events or some changes in society and the world that have kind of led people to have a reaction, either pushing their beliefs or like really digging into their beliefs and identifying with the left or the right on the political spectrum.
Yeah, we're not going to be talking so much about the history and the in-depth politics because, to be honest, for me personally, it's kind of a blind spot, that kind of history, politics, and just general geography of things, which is something I'm pretty embarrassed about and I'm slowly working to reconcile. But for now, that's a bit of a blind spot. So we're mostly just going to be talking. We've made a giant list of anecdotes or talking points or just general topics, and we're just going to be plucking them one at a time without rhyme or reason, or perhaps with some kind of rhyme or reason. We don't know. And we'll just be discussing them from our own thoughts and from a little bit of research that we've done and from general observation.
Yeah, I'd say we're not experts, but almost experts on kind of opinions and speculation of modern politics and modern happenings. And the thing is, I feel like it would be a completely different episode if we were talking about the rise of different political thoughts.
True.
But this is not about that. This is about how the times are impacting people's attachment to the far right, the rise of the far right.
I also don't know how academically you can talk about that. I think it's more truthful if you talk about it just as two students who have kind of observed it and enjoy learning about it. Or I wouldn't say enjoy, but feel it's a sense of duty to kind of document this very serious trend, which is happening with a lot of people our own age as well.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, Alicia, what have you been reading and watching this week?
I've been reading The Odyssey, which isn't really related to this, but The Odyssey is a Greek
epic story, yeah.
Yes. I'm also reading L'Étranger, which is a French book. Trying to learn French. I think I posted about that on our Instagram.
Quarantine French.
Doing pretty good, in my opinion.
Pretty bomb.
And I watched Jojo Rabbit, which was great. One of my favorite movies.
Really?
I'd say.
Yeah, I watched that too.
I said there was nothing wrong with it, and I think that's true. Like, usually I can find something, even in the best movies, some plot hole, some character who wasn't fully developed. This film was just every actor, every storyline was complete.
Yeah, I loved it. I've been reading Dante's Purgatory only 3 years after I finished Inferno. So
only 3 years.
It's taken me that long, but that's because the first book was so heavy and I was just been distracted by a bunch of other books. But this book so far has been a really pleasant surprise because when I started reading it, I thought, oh no, why would I read this just as the weather's getting nice? I'm reading about this kind of really heavy Catholic demons and, sins and things like that. But in fact, Purgatory is, the prose and the poetry are both really nice.
Yeah.
And it's just a really nice read so far. It's not so demonic as Inferno, which is good. And I've also been reading a non-fiction book called Philosophy in the Mass Age, which is pretty much spot on with the topics that I like to discuss about technology and how it's changed us and society and things like that. And yeah, I also watched Jojo Rabbit. We watched a bit of Gone with the Wind last night.
Oh yeah, we did.
Which was fun.
It was fun. I'd never watched Gone with the Wind. It was obviously set in the south of the United States, right as the Civil War was breaking out.
Yeah, I actually think this is those are two good movies to start this conversation with.
Yeah, I think so.
Coincidentally. Not really coincidentally.
Yeah, because they're both set from the point of view of people living on the right,
That's actually a really
fascists,
cool
or
double header, actually, Jojo Rabbit
it
and Gone with
is.
the Wind. I don't know how much of a double header, actually, because Gone with the Wind is 3.5 hours.
Yeah,
But
it's gonna take us
I
probably like
mean,
4 days to watch it,
yeah, I
but
mean, you know, just watch them together, kind of.
yeah. So another bit of a little disclaimer at the beginning of this is kind of about our own politics and experiences, because we're going to be talking as objectively as possible, and we may seem like
I'm
we're,
not.
well, I probably will be doing my best to be objective, but I might seem like I'm leaning one way or the other. But in reality, I'm definitely a left-leaning person.
Okay.
But I'd say I'm green, and I don't think
Green.
that's left or right. That's just like for the planet, for the people.
You're an environmental pragmatist.
Yeah.
Nice. I think, for me personally, I'll say I was always, for as long as I've been remotely interested in politics, I've considered myself pretty far on the left.
Yeah.
But that's kind of changed a little bit in the last few months, I would say, because, well, let's say this, like my views haven't changed, I think, but maybe I've just been a little bit more aware of what it means to identify yourself with a political group like that, or even a leaning, because the left, let's say in the West, as it is today, I don't think is a pure kind of representation of its own values.
I agree.
And I'm sure people, conservative purists would say the same about the right today.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of people who are against Trump, for instance, or whoever, who are like staunch Republicans, but are like, this is not what it's about. Yeah. And I think the left is actually something similar. But this is not to be like a centrist who's claiming both sides are the same. It's nothing like that. It's just that, yeah, when it comes to identifying in politics, I think it's a very dangerous game, because
I think so.
the parties and the people are always shifting around. So all you can kind of trust is your own values.
Yeah. And that's one thing we always talk about around election time is people say, well, you can't get mad at politics. Like, it's just, you can't get mad about it. But then it's like, it's morals. Like, that's what we think.
Yeah, politics is probably the one thing you should get mad about.
Yeah.
Or you should get passionate about. And two people passionate about two different things, which aren't irrelevant, which are really, it's about how you think society should run. It's about how you think people should be governed. It's going to end in, it's going to cause conflicts.
Yeah. But I don't think the things that are currently being partisan, like becoming partisan.
Okay.
So, like, I don't think climate change should be a left issue.
No.
And there's a lot of other human rights things that I don't understand why. Well, I do understand why they're currently being fought against on the right, such as feminist movements, or like, what are some other things that are like kind of that are really far left, but I don't understand why.
Trans?
Yeah.
Just like general gender stuff?
Yeah. I feel like gender stuff should just kind of be...
Yeah, we could start with that.
Yeah, I feel like it's just like...
It's on the list, so we can start with it.
Cool. So...
It says gender right there.
Dope.
Okay, so what are we saying? Why is feminism strictly a leftist issue? Or rather, why are leftists the only kind of proponents for it?
Well, it seems like it's because people on the right tend to be more traditionalist. That kind of is the root of everything.
Yeah.
And back in the good old days, women were less
powerful
than men, I guess.
Yeah.
But I just don't understand why you can't long for the good old days and say, oh, but that was dumb. Like, oh, racism, it wasn't good. Sexism wasn't good.
Yeah.
But I do want us to be growing our own food. Like, it's just, I feel like people should be able to separate those things, but they just
That's a really
can't
interesting
seem to.
Point, because our podcast attempts to do that.
Yes.
And it was to our own surprise when we were looking into how rare it is for podcasts or pages or people to have those thoughts, to separate that kind of longing for the past from its negatives.
Yeah.
And, rightfully condemn those. Even we were watching Gone with the Wind last night, and I was like, I really like those houses. And you said, yeah, but they were built by slaves. That's kind of the same thing. I was just talking about the style, but I think that it's possible to separate those things.
I mean, it is. I don't see why you can't.
A lot of people don't think it's ethical. People on the left.
Yeah.
So that's another thing, is that I found that leftists are purists, and they are idealists. So they
Yeah,
have their kind of,
visionaries.
they have their thoughts, they have their morals, and they have their ideals, and they do not want to compromise on them,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means losing, quote unquote,
Yeah,
politically. Whereas people on the right, I feel, are much more pragmatic, and they will just take what they can get and take their kind
yeah,
of incremental wins, and
yeah,
often are much more quick to line up behind a politician who they don't necessarily 100% agree with.
mm,
Contrast that with something like the Democrats right now and Biden, and
yeah,
especially Bernie supporters.
yeah,
No one's happy about it, and
mm-hmm.
there's a lot of talk about not voting for him and things like that. And that's pretty much the case always with Democrats.
Yeah,
And when I read into that, I see a lot of leftists complaining, like, oh, this is, the Republicans have done their job. This is kind of the fascist playbook. They turn the left against itself.
mm-hmm.
And my initial response to that is, no, the left isn't, it's not some external threat which turns the left against itself or whatever. The
No,
left just does that because to them, no one is far left enough
yeah,
in a lot of uh, times.
yeah. They're really. It's strange because on the left, as you're saying, they're very passionate about their morals, but then on the right, people are more religious, which is very. When you're religious, you believe in something wholeheartedly,
Yeah.
but they're willing to see the long game maybe more, or like
Yeah.
be a bit more realistic about things.
I don't really know what to make of that. I think religion's on the list as well. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of tough. Let's say we're talking about America
Mm-hmm.
and the Bible Belt are kind
Yeah.
of, that's Trump's base,
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost. So I don't know what to make of the fact that he's about as unchristian as you can get and yet has
Yeah.
their support 100%. It could be something like people who are already raised and immersed in an institution such as the church
Mm-hmm.
are more likely to be um, very partisan when it comes to only voting Republican and always voting Republican no matter what.
Yeah.
So they kind of align themselves more with that team.
Mm-hmm.
It could be something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's true. That seems like if what it is in the States, you're raised one way, and like
Yeah.
you just don't even think about how you're gonna vote,
Mm-hmm.
or you just say neither of these candidates are good and you don't vote. I can't imagine living in a two-party system. I
Well,
know they're
there's
not
more than two
officially two
parties.
parties, but it's like
Well, if you vote otherwise, a lot of people think you're just throwing your vote away.
But like Canada used to be pretty much two parties, but then the NDP people started voting for them. They got us universal health care and all that jazz, and then Green Party is starting to make waves. So it's just I don't think your vote is wasted no matter who you vote for, unless you're voting for like one of the silly parties like the Hippo Party or something.
So let's get back to feminism.
Yeah.
Because this is actually pretty core of it, I think.
So.
We've got written down a few things which are tangentially related to masculinity, femininity, feminism, gender politics, transgender, things like that, which might seem like a side issue when we're an environmental podcast or whatever, but I actually think it's quite core. Because as we said last week, I think a lot of people, the young people who are kind of falling for the appeal, the allure, whatever it is, of the temptation of far-right politics are male.
Yeah.
And I think it also has something to do with feeling like they are losing power.
Mm-hmm.
And so it comes as, I guess, to indulge in some kind of gender fantasy when they're, again, just the only people with power. We should project more.
Yeah. I feel like the reason that feminism is so important to, I'm going to say, the environment is because, well, this could be a whole episode in itself, but like, and they're kind of the ones that are the most harmed. They're vulnerable. That's the word I was looking for. So I feel like it's a similar vein of thinking. If you're against female rights, you're also going to be against the environment and against human rights, humans who are different from yourself.
Okay, well said. Let's talk about that kind of Fox News archetypical female reporter.
Okay.
Somewhat subservient, some kind of weird 50s throwback, typically blonde. What's that about? And also, let's say, the surprising amount of women who voted for Trump, despite his shady, to say the least, reputation when it comes to dealing with women.
Again, I feel like it's kind of a I was looking into the psychology behind people who vote left versus right, and people on the right they long for like comfort and certainty.
Yes.
And I feel like if you voted for Trump, you knew what you were getting into. Like, you knew what he was going to do. He wasn't going to make a bunch of changes. Like, whereas if someone on the left, like if Bernie had have been elected, everything would have changed. And I think it's a personality trait that is in people who are right-leaning, male or female.
Okay, I think it's really hard to talk about the issue in isolation. We have written down other things on the list, such as leftist deconstruction of traditional structures. And I think probably the biggest one most people on the right would say right now would be gender. They would say, how come the left insists now that there are 80 something genders and there's all this blurring of a line, which has to them always been a binary, and that makes things safe and you're either one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's something to do with that. And I also think that kind of emboldens the right and makes it gain new followers, because when it comes to transgender issues in the mainstream,
Mm-hmm.
the adoption of those politics has come, from my eyes, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so people on the right who maybe don't buy that are thinking like, what's all this?
Mm-hmm.
This is crazy. These are clowns. And so maybe they throw out the whole gender thing. And they say,
Yeah.
oh, and why can women vote now as well? I think it might be something to do with that.
Yeah. Everything's very black and white on the right, whereas things on the left are a bit more.
Well, very much more.
Yeah.
Of course,
All the
the right
shades.
likes borders.
Yeah.
The left
Very
likes
well put.
openness.
Yeah.
You know, that's a fact. Like, people who are more likely to vote left and lean liberal have high trait openness.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense then.
And that also aligns with creativity. High trait openness means you're kind of more compassionate and more creative.
Mm.
And we have that written down on the list as well, which is creative people tend to be more liberal.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting.
Me as well. I was thinking about usually creativity and.
I think it's because it comes from new ideas. It's mostly what creativity is. You're open to new ideas and you like to push the boundaries and things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, creativity, that's something that I find somewhat related to capitalism as a whole, which is something that I'll preface by saying I'm not very knowledgeable about.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism versus alternatives and what it means for society and what any alternatives mean for society.
Yeah.
But I have a neat quote about it. And it's from that book I was talking about called Philosophy in the Message.
Okay.
And the book is so far talking about how North America is kind of an extreme society in a way that no other human society before it has been. And it mentions a few reasons for this, one of which being that North America has very little history.
Yeah.
So they see themselves always as like the forgers of history and the makers of history. So they have kind of an extreme individuality.
Oh, okay.
And another thing, let me just find it, is that we are kind of born and bred capitalists. And that reflects in our values and the types of people that we value. And I have a quote here. The idea that we make history and that this is what is important is so completely taken for granted that we hardly think of it, let alone question it. The dominance of this spirit is seen in the activities which are considered most important in North America, those of the engineers, the businessmen, and the administrators. These are the people who are really doing something because they are changing the world. We see it negatively in the activities which are not considered important, those of the artists, the lovers, the thinkers, and the people of prayer, for these are all activities which do not change the world.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so that's the thing I think about our kind of hectic, fast-paced capitalist society, but I also think it's reflected in who the right props up versus who the left props up, because the right, well, recently we've seen Elon Musk been kind of blowing up on Twitter,
Yeah.
been doing a bunch of crazy things, and he's known as having a very incredibly high work rate, productivity, and financial success,
Mm-hmm.
and just general influence in the technological sphere as well as just society, I guess. And he was tweeting about, or I think he's suing like a county in California because they're trying to keep his factory closed. And he's like, no, we need to bring people back to work. despite
Okay.
Corona. So that's kind of what I was just reading about, which is
Yeah.
that we prop up productivity and efficiency
Mm-hmm.
and the capitalist kind of above all else.
Yeah.
But that goes kind of above my head, but it seems to me related to this conversation of left versus right.
Yeah, because people on the left on university campuses and in discussion forums, they're just completely anti-capitalist, probably because of that reason. They think they don't value creativity. They don't think creativity is a way forward, when in reality, creativity is the only way forward. It's the only way we're going to change things.
Yeah.
But I think you need creative thoughts about capitalism in order to imagine a future which is sustainable and more
Well said.
equal.
In the short term.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't think in this pursuit for sustainability, I don't think people on the extreme, let's say radical leftists are often saying, the only way to do this is to kind of overthrow society. We need to head towards some kind of more socialism, type of governance or something. And that's not really in my wheelhouse. I'm not really knowledgeable enough to say yes or no, or I support that or whatever. But I will say that it seems like that would not be a quick detour. It seems like that would take a long time.
Yeah.
And would divert a lot of time, thought, and resources from transitioning away from fossil fuels, which really needs to be the priority. So they would say, but you can't do that until you change society. That doesn't seem to me to be the case, because there are a lot of well-developed countries which don't pollute so much.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That are still at their heart capitalist.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think a capitalist mixed with a socialist society is like, for the next 100 years or so, kind of the best way forward. Because the thing with capitalism is like people are motivated by income and growth. But if the idea of growth becomes sustainability, then I think it'd be really efficient. If people are chasing sustainability as like the end goal of capitalism, which could be considered growth, then it would be more efficient than trying to say, okay, we're all going to be sharing, putting our money towards other people, because people seem to not be motivated through compassion, more through greed. Yeah.
Nice. This episode is turning out very, very kind of unstructured and jumbled. So let's just keep going with that. Next topic, Ayn Rand.
I don't know very much about Ayn Rand, but you wrote a whole essay about her in grade 12.
Yeah, on the Fountainhead, because I wanted a scholarship, which I did not get. But now I'm a part of her institute, and I'm always invited to their retreats, and I'm always sent a kind of picture of their retreats every October, I think it is. And it's just kind of the whitest looking group of high school kids you'll ever see, and they're all wearing suits. And I also got a free book called Capitalism from Ayn Rand, and it's kind of her essay on it. Excited to read that. But I wanted to talk about her because I've been thinking about the Fountainhead recently. Basically, it has this protagonist called Howard Rourke, who I wrote this long essay about.
Yes.
And she was not what I would call a very good writer, because she just wrote, all her characters were just vehicles for her philosophy.
Yes.
And it was very, very transparent, which is not what I call great writing. But her philosophy is basically be as individualistic as you can. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Don't give. She was famous for being against selflessness and giving and charity and things like that. Yeah. And also famously she's kind of idolized by a lot of people in the Republican Party. So that's interesting, such as a former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. But I want to talk about that kind of image of that's what the ideal person is.
It's one of the most absurd things I'd ever heard in my life. Because...
So he's an architect in the book.
Yeah.
And he's 100% uncompromising, to the point of being kicked out of school, being pretty much cast out in the streets because he can't get any contracts because his designs are so wild, and they're just basically his style. It's kind of described in the book. I think in the real world, we'd call it modernism. It's just very, very functional. It does away with any kind of traditional decoration or pillars or any kind of niceness like that. It's just strictly functional. And he's super uncompromising until in the end, everyone falls for his style and him, and they say, wow, you were right all along. And the kind of suck up, people pleaser architect who was always one step ahead ends up losing. Yeah, and that's basically the story.
Okay.
Which in itself, I mean, stick to your guns.
Yeah, be confident in your work. That
Yeah,
doesn't seem
that's
too
fine.
bad.
But then you read a little bit more about it and you're like, okay, so he and the female protagonist, their kind of big moment of love was him raping her and things like that. And this is when it gets entwined with femininity, which was on our list.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that? Or is that just a really random thing?
I think it's just kind of, it's a
I'll put
good
it like
example
this.
of philosophy,
It
which...
was written by a woman, and she was probably very, very staunch supporter of capitalism and all things conservative. And that is kind of her ideal gender dynamic.
Yeah. I genuinely can't understand.
There's something in that which reminds me of the amount of women who voted Trump. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or who lean right today.
There's something about that confuses me. As someone who is a Christian, raised Christian, and right-leaning as I grew up, just because I'm a very, like, modest, conservative person.
That's true.
And I feel like in theory, if right-leaning things were actually in line with, in North America, it's a very, like, Bible versus non-Bible thing, it seems. If it was in line with the Bible, I would be on board with it, because I feel like I'm gonna get into, because we were talking about, so, like, Jesus was was pro women.
Buckle up, everyone.
I don't understand why it's so connected with the past when women weren't equal, but now we kind of realize women and men are equal. Racism's a bad thing, and that's what the Bible preaches. It's what Christianity preaches: is that everyone is equal and loved by God. Just believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. But for some reason, no one's ever gotten that in the last 2,000 years. And it frustrates me to think women especially are comfortable with supporting people who are so blatantly misogynistic.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm saying it's against, like, I mean, it's not like I'm saying being on the right is a bad thing, being a Christian is a bad thing. I'm just saying I don't understand why. I don't understand.
You don't understand why those two overlap so often?
I really, really don't, because
Christianity
it doesn't seem like
and conservatism.
Christianity and conservatism. Conservatism meaning
the bad things of conservatism, would say that.
I don't understand it, and I really can't wrap my head around it.
Slightly a little bit more off topic, but one thing I know when I've read, I think an academic journal on it, or an article, I mean, is that in America, the church in white communities is always symbolic of conservatism. Mm-hmm. But, counter to what you were just saying, in the black community, the church is almost always a sign of liberal politics. Martin Luther King was a revolutionary and he was like a reverend. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something to do with it. And so you mentioned power. It's probably more about power than it is about the dogma or anything like that.
I think so.
It's probably, that's what conservatism is. It's about conserving what was had. Mm-hmm. So it probably doesn't get much deeper than that. Yeah.
I just think you can be conservative, and I think being conservative is fine in essence, but I just think we need to disconnect these bad things about the past from it. Just people on the right need to learn how to, pick and choose from the past.
Well, that's an interesting way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
Let's move on from that completely unfinished thought to another one, which is taking down old statues / racist old cartoons. And I had this under a subheading of leftist deconstruction of traditional structures, because those were just two examples I thought of. Mm-hmm. Let's say the Civil War hero for the South. There's statues of them who, like, a university petitions to get removed, and it gets removed. Yes. And there's uproar over that because it's, their heritage or whatever. For me, I think it's a terrible, terrible thing when that happens. Much like I think anytime there's a cancellation of an old celebrity or an old movie maker from the 50s or something, I think it's an awful occurrence.
Okay.
Not, should I say ethically? When I say awful, I mean practically. This is not a good thing to do. It won't end well when you just kind of, it's essentially, I think, trying to erase history.
Okay.
And it's the same with like old Disney cartoons, when
Mm-hmm.
people just kind of hide those away, and it's like, oh, we should never watch those anymore. I don't like that. Or like, oh, we should not have that statue up anymore. I don't like that. It doesn't mean that you are agreeing with those values. That's the mistake people make, I think. By having that old Southern military guy up in a statue on the street, it doesn't mean that you're kind of celebrating him. Your relationship to that statue can change over time. So basically, maybe when it was first erected, it was because he was a hero or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But now that opinions change, you can just have it up as a reminder.
Okay.
Things like that. I feel pretty strongly about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think doing the opposite is really, really a mistake.
Yeah. To an extent, like, I agree with your thoughts. However, there's a certain status that comes with having a building named after you, a state, a city, having a statue. If there's a statue of you, it means you're to be revered, or it's an honor.
No,
I think so.
I disagree.
No one named a street saying Hitler Street as a reminder.
No, but it could become that over time. Well, what they're basically the equivalent would be, if you want to talk Hitler, the equivalent would be something like, let's get rid of the concentration camps. But instead it's, let's walk around them.
Those weren't built as...
I'm saying it was built with one function, and you don't kind of denounce that function by just removing it or destroying it. You kind of denounce it by, you learn from it. And I think there's a big difference. And I think the kind of mob mentality that comes with when people learn that John Wayne was really racist and so let's never watch the Westerns again, I really, really think that's not the way forward.
I understand.
Okay. Next thing, which I think is relevant. How to deal with the Nazis. What is the end goal? This is something that always vexed me when I was younger. And then, if you recall, it used to send me into spiraling rages and just extreme moral explosions, conundrums. Because it'd always be like, we're supposed to be kind to everyone, but these people don't deserve kindness. And that would always be kind of my internal conflict.
Yes.
And especially when I was learning about, World War II Nazis, it's like they weren't defeated with kindness. It was violence. It was war. So I would always think, at what point do you have to turn that, have to flip into that?
I don't know. That's a hard one.
I know it is. It's probably the hardest question
it's probably
for humans,
question.
or one of the hardest questions, which
Yeah.
is how do you deal with people, not just that you don't like, but who are dangerous?
I think it's just kind of...
And this is a problem that society kind of is facing as a whole right now, and always, again, the left is never happy enough with how it's being dealt with. For instance, I'll just talk about one non-violent way, which is deplatforming.
Yeah.
The left is always, always, always very, very angry with Facebook and Twitter and even Instagram because they don't deplatform enough people who the left deems to be
spreading
fake news or hate or bad messages.
Yeah.
And they say, these are private companies, private platforms, so they should just get rid of them. Again, I don't think that works.
I don't think that works.
Maybe in the short term, okay, now I don't have to see it in the timeline, or I don't have to hear it in the headlines. But in the long run, I don't think it works at all.
No, because they're just going to go instead of a little.
I think it only kind of strengthens their cause, strengthens their feeling of being oppressed and of and that kind of complex they have, that victim mentality.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest modern times relationship to the rise of the far right is the internet and the identification with a religious
A political.
political group.
Yeah.
And like, but the only thing I found online about this, like a scientific article about it, was that as the internet came about, media outlets became less objective, became more biased, like either right or left, because they realized they could make money by catering to people's kind of deep down, not fully fleshed out
Subconscious.
Yes.
I love that. Because, well, and I don't love that. That's the core of it. That
Yeah.
anonymity, which allows your distaste for, which allows your xenophobia to come out, your sexism to come out. The internet definitely enables that at a level never before seen, I think, because it's basically the mob mentality, that kind of faceless mob, which I associate anyway with, let's say, with political extremes on both sides, at your fingertips all the time. You can always join a forum and just, meld in with that crowd, kind of.
Yeah, just get into a vacuum where it's just like feeding you, and you're just kind of, and you think you're right because it's something that comes from like deep within you. But everyone has evil thoughts, and everyone has these kind of more rogue thoughts that in reality have no grounding most of the time, or aren't actually the right thing to do. But they think, well, this is what I feel inside, so it must be right. And then if you can get assurance that they're, or validation, then you're going to just get really into it, which isn't a good thing.
So how to deal with Nazis? Back to that. Here's what I think. You don't try to deplatform them. If you mute them, okay, that works in the short run. In the long run, I think it will only make them more, give their arguments more credence, because they will, it kind of lends weight to their narrative that they are being oppressed and that they are being replaced or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
And basically, for me, the end goal is to have less Nazis. I really think, like, that sounds obvious, but when people are dealing with these kind of extremes, I think they never like clearly lay out what is the goal here. What do we want to do? Do we just want to win? Politically, because you can do that, but it won't necessarily help you win in the long run.
No.
For me, the goal is to have less Nazis, have people be kinder, but all those things.
Yes.
So I think the best way to do that is to convert Nazis, make them not Nazis, that kind of thing.
Teach compassion and
unfortunately
patience.
you have to do that. Like, it sounds really bad, but you have to do that until someone's literally threatened to take over the world. You that's what should be done. I don't think you should meet violence and hate with violence and hate.
Of course not.
I think that you should be forceful, and you should be definitive when you are saying that's not okay, we don't do that. But I think
there's certain things when you have to kind of break and just be like really firm in your I'm reminded of like a really inspiring news story, which is a black guy in the US, don't remember his name, who I think I sent it to you maybe a year ago, who was kind of famous for meeting KKK members and making them disown the robe or whatever, their membership, the badge or something. Yeah. And I was like, that's it. That is it.
Like, that's the ideal.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And I that still touched me. I thought that was awesome. And it reminds me of a lot of stories of Martin Luther King as well, when he was like on his way to speeches or to gatherings or whatever, and he would just be they'd drive him up in the car, and there'd be like an angry mob outside, and they'd be like, you can't get out here, and he'd be like, I'm getting out, and he just got out and would just like take the beating every time and be incredibly gracious and compassionate. And that's kind of the Jesus teaching, right? Yeah. Which is to love those who hate you, love thy enemy, things like that.
That was an interesting
But it's the hardest thing to do. I mean, it's by far the hardest thing as a human to do. Yeah. Maybe, by far, I don't know. I think compassion and like... For people who are generally what some might call deplorable, Yeah. We should, well, I mean, I don't know. what to say
We're
about
not
moral
excusing it.
relativism.
I'm not saying, like, because the thing is, I feel like a lot of the hate comes from fear of change, fear of losing power, fear
That's
of becoming
the thing. Yeah.
like, becoming the oppressed one, because you kind of maybe have lived your whole life seeing people be oppressed and think, I don't want to be like that, so I'm going to hold on to my power.
Good point. And I don't think you should be,
So,
I don't think we should be like coddling those kind of people.
no.
But I really think that to completely ignore the reasons why they are like that is just foolish, and it won't work in the long run.
No.
So it's not being apologetic, but you have to understand them and you have to know. Otherwise, I think in the long run, like they'll win.
Yeah, just because they're willing to take it slow.
Yeah.
But like the thing is, I feel like the answer is exposure in a more personal way than they're used to. Because currently people are being exposed to the world, which is super globalized, through the news, through like crazy stories that come from all over the world, or through biased media that they're consuming. But if they actually met somebody who is different than them, they'd probably be like, ah, you're not bad, you're just like me.
This is most of the let's say racism is probably the easiest one. And I have written down here as well, urban/rural divide. It's like, well, most of the racists live in rural places.
Where they don't go to school with people of different...
Where they've never met anyone who isn't their color.
Yeah.
It's like, that's why.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it gets into issues of like, well, then can you blame people? You know, at what point do you say it's just someone's upbringing, or it's just this, or it's just that? Because, never personally being exposed to someone from a different ethnicity is one thing, and especially when they are maybe raised in a media bubble, which is all exclusively devoted to showing negative depictions of people from other ethnicities. It's like, well, that person's not going to grow up to be very compassionate and understanding and kind of a big espouser of equality.
Yeah.
But, you know, so let's take that person who's grown up in that kind of bubble, never met anyone who isn't their color. Maybe it's a deeply sexist town they're in or whatever. And then they say something online, go to a Trump rally or whatever, and maybe they go on Facebook and they post their post about, you know, Trump, this Make America Great Again, whatever. And then all their comments are just leftists kind of tearing them apart, saying, wow, you racist, you know, throwing slurs and like mean words at them and stuff. It's like, what's that going to do? Is it going to make them, you know, less racist? No.
What if someone replied to them and said, hey, hey, you're actually being really mean and closed-minded. And not closed-minded. Closed-minded always makes people feel targeted. But like, just pick the right words that make someone realize that they're being mean.
The current discourse, all it does is make people kind of entrench themselves ever deeper. And turn it into even more of an us versus them mentality, which, I mean, it is because it's politics. It is that. But I'm just saying, if you want more people on your side, or if you want your side to become the norm and mainstream, you have to think before you deal with people who aren't on that side.
Yeah.
Okay, next thing. Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
I guess I'll talk about him because I started listening to him a few months ago. Well, maybe a couple of years ago, but mostly just the videos on what he says about... Let's introduce who it is first.
Is he a psychologist?
Yeah, he was a clinical psychologist and professor at the University of Toronto who kind of achieved notoriety and infamy in 2017, I think, maybe 2016, because he was very vocally against a bill that Canada was introducing, which was adding to the hate speech when you like mislabel someone's pronoun.
Okay.
So that's kind of what made him famous, which was that he didn't... Well, sorry, it was if you didn't use someone's chosen pronoun, something like that.
Okay.
It was some kind of semantic thing about he didn't like that there was a law which was forcing people to say something.
Yes.
It was fairly innocuous, but I think it mostly got big because it was like a somewhat high profile. Someone's seen to be speaking out against transgender rights or something, even though from my perspective it wasn't that at all. It was just a kind of semantic thing about word choice. which he thought was symbolic of a kind of growing leftist tyranny that started from the universities, which is okay, which sounds crazy, but isn't, because we go to university.
That's a whole discussion, I feel like, for another day, maybe.
But anyway, yeah, so that was him. That's kind of what made him famous. But what I mostly like hearing him talk about is kind of his academic area of expertise, which is kind of a Jungian analysis of mythology and archetypes and stories as they manifest in society, either through the individual or through the collective. I find that fascinating, and it has really little to do with politics, but you see why those kind of sensationalized political statements and opinions are what someone like that would be known for.
Yeah, and his audience is a young male demographic.
I think so. I'm pretty sure that's mostly it, because I think maybe when the kind of infamy came, he maybe switched his topics of discussion a little bit geared towards more self-help. But it's
maybe
still,
he was trying to use his platform to be like, hey guys, like, because he was like, oh, I'm gonna have a bunch of people who are
exactly
really far right leaning listening to me, so maybe I can change their minds or make them try and better themselves instead of targeting.
I don't think that was the main goal.
No, I really don't know too much about him.
So I would describe him as a conservative.
Okay.
I've never heard him say anything very racist.
Okay.
At all. I've never heard him say anything that I would deem to be sexist.
Okay.
But he kind of acknowledges differences between sexes, differences between genders, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Which I suppose in the kind of politics, modern politics as it is today, is deemed quite controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I had him on the list is just because he has a big emphasis on the individual. The individual as a savior of society, and that kind of the wrongs with society can be fixed through fixing oneself.
Okay.
Which I think is a very, very noble idea.
Yeah.
And this is what makes people get better. And this is something that I think is taken to extremes on the very, very far right, where ideals are held up above everything else. That's kind of the connection with Ayn Rand.
Okay.
And also another weird tangent, which is when I was trying to read Nietzsche a couple months ago and not at all understanding it, but understanding they had a topic called the Übermensch, the overman, which meant someone who had basically kind of transcended a little bit, I suppose, and was forming their own values and things like that, and was just kind of like Howard Rourke, but a less disgusting one. Okay, a more noble one. And that was also a big tenet of the Nazi philosophy, which were they took it racially, genetically, which was that these people are better. But I think, those examples are obviously morally deplorable.
Yes.
But I think there's a truth in that there should be ideals for people. And I think that the modern right is maybe reacting a little bit to the fact that it seems as if the left has done away with any form of ideal. Yeah. And any form of judgment. Which is not a good thing. And that's also
standards
that's also where I think a lot of the left's contempt for capitalism comes from, but maybe we can talk about that another day.
Yeah. So the thing is, it's like there needs to be standards, but I don't think they have to be set by one person or one party.
Well, that'll never be good, because then
of course not.
Their standards will just be what looks like them.
Yeah.
That's dangerous.
But I think you just kind of need to set your own standards for yourself.
Or you trust standards which have been kind of formed over thousands of years. So this is something else I have written down on the list. Jesus equals mercy plus judgment. Because now we get to the really Christian portion of the show.
Yes.
No, not really, but it's just the fact that I think the Jesus story has been accepted by, billions of people? Yeah. Him as the ideal. Yeah. So it seems like as good a place as any to get your ideals from. And I think what you can boil down from what is celebrated about him and his personality is probably maybe two things.
Honesty and compassion.
Yeah.
And I feel like on the right, honesty is very valued. They're more realistic. On the left, they're a lot less realistic. They're more into fantasy, not fantasy, but idealism.
The right would describe it as naivety.
Yes.
But they are way more compassionate.
On the left, yeah.
So and both of those two things are necessary.
They're both good, yes.
And that's also described in the Bible when people say that God is representative of both judgment and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me think that the left and the right are not, it's not like one side is better. In fact, I don't think it's even possible to say that one side is better.
It's a yin and a yang.
Yeah. And this is not talking about like modern politics or this politician versus this politician or this party versus this party, but just the ideals in themselves.
Yeah.
I don't really think that you can say that one side is better. It's kind of like saying that the direction, like east is necessarily better than west or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it doesn't really make sense because it's just a direction. It's not even a destination.
Yeah.
So I like to think of society as kind of just like a tug and war, like a push and pull between the left and the right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you need a little bit of this and sometimes you need a little bit of that.
It just kind of depends on the issue.
Yes. And
so,
the time.
Yes, exactly. So it's like climate change, we need to be really drastic about it. So a bit more idealist, a bit more compassionate, caring about people being selfless. We're going to pull a bit to the left. Then we need, what's a positive right trait?
Well, you need security. You need police.
Yes.
That kind of thing, you know.
You need police.
Laws.
We advocate for degrowth and like kind of smaller scale interactions.
Smaller government.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
So that's a bit more
surveillance. We don't want that.
No.
That's another thing.
Yeah. We want people to be confident in their identities, and if that's kind of center, in my opinion.
Yeah. Anything else that you wanted to mention?
I feel that's a really good place to end it.
Okay. I have no poem today, but hopefully for the last 50 minutes we have been just one long stream of spoken word poetry.
Yeah, there we go.
So just take that as today's poem, guys.
Yeah, we're going to be back next week with microphones, a little bit more structure, a little less sleepy, and it will be great.
And next week's episode is about modern art and architecture, so
yeah, we're going to be picking up from some of the things that we talked about today, about creativity, I think, on the right and left, and a bit more into the actual art, because we're big art fans.
Yeah. We're on Instagram at @the_environmental, and we post cool science videos, really cool graphic design, and some behind-the-scenes information about our episodes and our topics and our philosophies and our worldview and our inspirations.
Bada bing, bada boom.
Yep, and we have new episodes every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Hope you're all having a great
day.